Hey, Spuddies, Potato McWhiskey here, and today we're going to be criticizing Humankind. Now, my last few videos of the game have been overwhelmingly positive, everyone's really liked them, and my impression of the game has always been really good, and I was treating the game with, some leeway and kindness because, it was obviously going through rapid development. You could tell a lot changed between each open dev and beta, and so I was mostly looking for things that I liked about the game and things that I thought worked well. And I didn't necessarily totally avoid criticizing the game. There's a few small issues with it that I've talked about before, most notably a little bit of balance, a little bit of UI frustration, stuff like that. Now, this also isn't like a review of the game, because obviously I'm going to be talking about the closed beta build, which isn't the final game. There's another 2 months of development, and when you're this late into a game cycle, a lot can actually change very quickly, because a lot of the work you do when you're building up a game is very technical and very technology heavy, right? You're building the engine, the game systems, you're building how the UI works, all that sort of stuff. And right now, the game is undergoing its sort of rapid gameplay evolution, like where they're getting the numbers right, they're getting the feel right, they're getting the abilities right, they're tweaking things, they're adjusting things, and that's good, that's healthy, that's where we want the game to be, because the game is in a decent state, but there are a few things about it that bother me. Now, the first, most obvious one is balance, okay? Some of the units in the game are really too strong, and, by proxy, that means some of the civs or cultures in the game are too strong. The Huns and the Mongols kind of stand out. More so the Huns than the Mongols, because the Huns come earlier, I believe. Like, the Huns are, basically their units are like a grey goo. They have ridiculously high combat strength, and they can create more of themselves just from fighting and ransacking. And basically, you can snowball to an insane level playing as the Huns, which is fine. I think it's okay for that to be the way it is, but I think the numbers are just a little bit too out of whack for that. And there's a lot of stuff like that in the game. Some of the emblematic quarters that cultures have are either like ridiculous, like they do an insane amount for you, or they're kind of really underwhelming, like Rome's bonus. By virtue of the way the game mechanics work, I thought Rome was actually quite strong, and then I spent some more time with the game and I realized that actually Rome has a lot of problems. The Triumphal Arch is a cool building, it gives you plenty of stability, it gives you lots of influence, and what could be more powerful than being able to cram more units into your army? But as I spent more time with the game systems, like the combat system, I realized that how many units you can cram into a single stack doesn't actually really matter that much, because you can always just bring a near infinite number of reinforcements into a battle just by moving extra armies onto the battle tiles. I think that's really just down to refinement. I think that's mostly down to, a little bit of tweaking and stuff. I feel like Rome does need a little bit of a rework, and I think some of the early game civs are really, really powerful. Some districts are just obviously insane. Like there's one of the big problems the game has with balance is quadratic scaling, and this is sort of a much bigger criticism of it in its current state. And again, I want to make sure this isn't a review. I think the developers will be able to address a lot of these concerns before launch. But so to give you an example of the quadratic scaling problem is that, Korea is like a really good example. So if you build a Seowan, which is their unique quarter, in a region, it gives you +3 science per science district. But if you have 4 regions, now you're getting +12 science per science district, which means every time you build a science district, you're getting a ridiculous amount of science. And that's not even without talking about how their coastal science ability is a little bit broken, because you can put a harbor down and essentially extract 4 science per tile on the coast, and then if you have a Seowan, every Seowan you build will increase that by 3. So if you have 4 regions, you'll be getting, you'll have 4 coastlines and 4 Seowans, which means you're pulling in somewhere like 15 science per tile. You also have 4 harbor. It just, a single city can produce, several thousand science for very little investment, which I think is a cool ability, but I think the numbers are just out of whack. Especially when it comes to the quadratic scaling thing. So I think that's something they're going to want to look into with regards to emblematic quarters, is to just try to get the scaling a little bit more correct. I think there was like one of the Khmer ones, I think is it gives you +1 food per district you've built. So if you have 20 districts in a single region, you'll get 20 food. But if you have 30 districts over 4 regions and you build 4 of those, quadratically scaling districts, you'll actually be getting 120 food, and it's not that much of an investment to do that. And I think that's where the game loses the run of itself a little bit when it comes to balance. The numbers get too big too quickly, and as a consequence, the game is balanced around the numbers getting too big too quickly and scaling so hard that if you don't go for these like quadratically scaling things, building things in your cities can actually feel really sluggish, because otherwise, if they didn't, balance the game around these really high scaling districts, you would have trouble. You would have trouble. You would get a civ that would just like connect all their cities into one, build all their scaling districts, and then boom, crank out 10 units a turn or something. So I think that's a big problem with it. I also think there are a lot of problems with the infrastructure buildings, which are basically like your normal buildings in a regular 4X game. So for those of you who don't know, there's basically 2 types of infrastructure you can build in your city. Well, there's technically 3, 4 if you count units. But there's like your quarters, which are like districts in Civ, or in Endless Legend, if you're familiar with that, and these will generate a resource, extract from the terrain, and give you a population job. Then you have these infrastructures, and infrastructures tend to be scaling. And what I mean by that is, so whereas, you build a quarter and it's like, okay, gives you +1 production and +1 production for every adjacent district of the same type. That is scaling, but it's a fairly linear scaling. There's a limit to how big that can get. But then some of the infrastructures will be like +1 production on your tiles that are being exploited. And then it's like, okay, so now I'm scaling twice. I'm getting linear scaling off of both building my district and exploiting the terrain. So if I start just spamming these out in a long snake and exploit as much terrain as possible, my production actually shoots off to the moon very, very quickly. And I think there's just a little bit too much abundance of resources in the game. The numbers just get too, when it comes to like food and production, I think the numbers just get a little bit too big, a little bit too quickly, and it's not my favorite thing ever. I would like to see maybe a pivot in the game design to de-emphasize how important quarters are in the early game, and maybe because I don't really know how I feel is like in the ancient era. I'm spamming down a bunch of farmer quarters and maker quarters. I feel like that needs some adjustments, and not only that, but I also feel like science is a little bit too slow, and it feels wrong to me that a lot of my science comes from like dedicating my population to science. Like thematically in the game, I feel like science should be more of a passive endeavor. I feel like maybe the fame system could be adapted or something to make early game science more achievement based. And what I mean by that is, instead of say unlocking city defense by researching it, you would unlock city defense, which would give you your basic warrior unit. You would unlock it by spotting a barbarian, and then now you have city defense. And then I also think maybe passive science should be more of a bigger deal in the early game. If you spot an enemy that has a unit or technology you have, maybe that would make a little bit more sense. I don't know, it just feels a little bit out of whack, and that sort of also goes hand in hand with the science feeling very, very slow in this particular build. I think they have, what they have here is actually a really interesting game, and they just kind of need to tweak and make the systems like play a little bit nicer with each other. It's sort of like, imagine if you had a jigsaw puzzle, and each individual piece of that jigsaw puzzle is actually really beautiful and like a really beautiful piece, but it's when you start trying to put them together, it's like they weren't cut properly and they just don't quite click in the satisfying way you would expect jigsaw pieces to sort of fit together. Maybe the edges are a little bit burred or whatever. Hopefully that gives you an idea of what I'm talking about, because like on an individual level, the sort of district building mechanic is really, really fun. But you're kind of hamstrung a little bit by the stability mechanic, which is intentional. It's meant to hold you back. It's meant to make you think about your decisions. But I think there's a little bit too much feeding into the stability system. Like, so what I mean by that is the higher your stability, the more influence you get. The building a district or unique quarter or whatever will lower your stability depending on the district. Building, connecting regions to your cities will lower your stability. There's just a lot. I felt like when I was playing that I had this really, really cool system of like building interesting cities, and then I was being sort of held back by the game systems. What this kind of leads me to feel is that's actually fine. Like, that system is fine, and it just needs like some small numbers tweaks, maybe some adjustments. But generally, there are a lot of sources to get your stability back up and make it so that you're not suffering too badly from having built up a big city and connecting a bunch of stuff to it. Like, it generally, that system generally works. Where it kind of breaks down to me is in the feel. It feels wrong to me to be sort of building a semi-urban city in the ancient era. If I play the correct civilization, or I play the correct way, I can just spam out a whole bunch of different districts and different things, and that just I don't know how I feel like it, because I feel like the early game should be much more rural. You should spend a lot more time identifying interesting terrain to work. You should be building small little feeder villages. But the thing is, the game doesn't give you access to the hamlet, which is like the small feeder village for your cities, until much later in the game. And that feels a little bit backwards to me thematically. I think maybe what I would like to see, and this is a thought now, this is just the first idea that came to my head. So how it works in the game right now is that if you build a quarter, it costs you 10 stability. And that's just a flat cost. It always costs you 10 stability. Now, it differs based on the individual district. Some districts don't have a stability cost, but generally speaking, if you're building a district, it's going to cost you 10 stability. What I would like to maybe see is that really early in the game, districts cost like 20 stability. But then as you invent, public health measures, like for example, public baths, this would, reduce the stability cost of your districts, right? So now they only cost 18 stability. So if you build 5 and you get public baths, it gives you a little bit of stability itself, reduces the stability cost of your districts, and then you can plop down some more districts. I think that would feel just a little bit nicer to me, depending on how that was structured and done. And then maybe you could also have it to where when you advance to the next era, your districts cost 1 less stability. So you're slowly sort of making the maintenance cost of these districts cheaper, and you can get more of them in. And then maybe I would emphasize more on actually building small feeder towns that sort of feed a city. I don't know if that idea works perfectly, but it's kind of just like where my head is. I feel like it feels wrong to me to be building large urbanized cities early in the game, when I feel like the game should have a much more rural focus in like the ancient and classical era. That should be more about like exploiting the terrain, getting as many tiles worked as possible, for example. And then later on in the game, you slowly transition to a more urban model where your quarters are much more efficient, they're much more powerful, they are easier to build, they're cheaper to build. And the thing is, they kind of have a lot of those systems already in the game, but I think they're just not tweaked and implemented right. And so that's why I'm kind of saying I'd like to see that get some changes, and it probably will get changes. I would be surprised if we don't see some tweaks, not necessarily along the lines of what I said, but just generally in how the feel of the game is. Now, I think it should be possible to build a large city in the ancient era if you want. And that's where like the whole like connecting regions to your capital thing, I think, would come in. I feel like that shouldn't cost stability, because you're actually making a fairly big sacrifice. I mean, you get a big advantage, don't get me wrong, connecting a region to your capital. But yeah, it feels a little bit weird to me. And with regards to scaling, I was talking about scaling earlier, about scaling off the terrain. A lot of the buildings, like the infrastructures in the game, they'll give you, like, take public baths, I think it is, or aqueducts. It just gives you 15 stability. And that feels a little bit... It's okay, but I think I'd like to see a little, just a little bit more scaling off of the meta region. So, like, let's say you built a public bath in a city, and instead of it just giving you 15 stability, maybe it gave you 10 stability plus 2-3 stability per region that you had attached. So if you have a 5 region capital and you build the public baths, maybe you get 20 stability instead of 12 if you had just one region, or 14 if you had 2. And I think little bits of scaling like that would just make the game feel a smidge nicer, because right now it feels to me the metagame is very much so in the early game, get as many cities down as possible, because stability can be quite hard to find in the early game. And your infrastructures don't scale very well. Like, for example, there's a couple of infrastructures in the game where they're literally like tax office, and it is just +3 gold. And then when you compare it to something like, I think it's the Copper Forge, which gives you 5 production per copper resource you have, +1 production on your maker's quarters, +1 production per maker quarter, per adjacent maker quarter. And it it has all these abilities. And I think it also makes your strategic resources generate more resources. And I'm looking at this building, and I build it, and I have 2 copper, and I'm like, I'm getting 10 production, plus I have like 3-4 industrial zone type buildings over here. So that's getting me another like 12 production. And then I kind of scroll down the list, and I see this building called the tax office, which is twice as expensive, and it's literally just like +3 gold. And that feels really wrong to me. And I think I feel like something like the tax office should obviously be quite simple. It should be, +1 gold per 3 population and 3 base gold, something like that. I think my problem with the game's balance with regards to that is that some things scale a little bit too hard, and some things don't scale at all or don't scale enough. So I'd like to see a little bit more things like that. I'd like to see just some things brought in line and some things pushed up. And I think, but overall, I think the balance of the game is actually quite close to where it needs to be. A lot of the civs, there are a lot of outliers, I'm not going to lie. There are a lot of outlier cultures that have insane abilities and just do ridiculous things with the game map. And then there's a lot of civs that just don't do much. And I'd like to see the civs that don't do much to get a little bit of a boost. And then I'd like to see the civs that are kind of ridiculous and game breaking just get brought back in line. I think let them have their ability. Let Korea get the science from water. But does it need to be 4 science per water tile? Maybe 1 science is enough. And does it need to be, if you build a Seiya 1, that actually gives another 3 science to your water tiles? Maybe give it like +5 science per harbor in the city. That way you still get the same thematic scaling off of water, it's just that the numbers aren't quite as out of whack. And that's the kind of stuff I would like to see. Now, there are a few other problems with the game that I've talked about. I really don't like the fog of war. It's too bright. And this is actually a problem I had with a game I played a long time ago, and I basically petitioned the developer of this game. It's a game called Oriental Empires. And in that game, there was this really, really bad fog of war thing. And it was like this really washed out gray-white fog. And when I looked at it, it made my eyes feel like they were unfocused. It was painful. It was like looking at television noise. And I'm getting that same exact feeling from Humankind when I look at the fog of war. Or even the unexplored map. I think those colors need to be adjusted. Make the fog a little bit darker. Maybe I'm a traditionalist. Maybe people will find it fine. But I personally, I love like black or gray fog of war is totally fine. And then the unexplored map itself, I would like to see that adjusted. It just has this. It has this TV noise, like you're watching snow on a TV, like an old CRT. It has that feeling, and it really makes me feel like I get eye strain playing, basically. And that's something I'd like to see adjusted. Because going back to Oriental Empires, I actually petitioned the developer And initially I was told, well, look, the fog is kind of part of the game. We don't want to remove it. And then later on, they ended up actually putting in an option to remove that sort of white fog effect. And when I went back to play the game, I actually had so much more fun because I didn't even realize how badly I was being affected by this sort of fog stuff and how it was affecting my eyes. And it made it really hard to see them. And the same thing actually happened in Imperator Rome. I don't know if you guys played that game on release, but they had like this really strong fog of war effect. It was like very washed out, bright white grey sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but it was like this really bad fog effect on tiles you couldn't see or provinces you couldn't see, to the point there was a day one patch by the community to remove that fog of war. And I genuinely found the game unplayable without that patch, and I'm getting the same concern with Humankind. Now that I've spent some time with it, I'm starting to notice these things are bothering me, and I just really want to toggle in the options to just lower the hue of the fog of war or something, just because the fog of war just feels really it upsets me. It really does. It makes it hard for me to even look at the game sometimes. It didn't bother me so much when I spent a decent number of, when I only spent like a little bit of time with it, but the more time, when I started spending a decent amount of time with the game, I can't say this sentence, it really did start to affect me. And that color problem also goes doubly with the color layout when you start a battle. There's like this big sort of open battlescape with this grayscale thing. Now you can disable that, but then you can't tell where your battles are. I'd like to see that get some adjustments. I'd like to see, the color there just feels wrong to me. The color just, it's that same washed out gray color that just makes me feel like my eyes are out of focus. Like, you know, you ever like wake up or something, or, you know, you get like gunk in your eye and it has that kind of blurry off-white look to the world because it's scattering all the light. That's how I feel when I look at the battles in Humankind, and that's how I feel when I look at the map of Humankind when, you know, there's fog of war and stuff on the screen. You know, the great thing is, like, problems like that are actually fairly easy to solve, because it might literally, you know, as far as I know, it might be a pretty easy problem to solve, because it might just be like an options toggle to turn it off or to change the color, right? And that's just like you're changing an alpha value in a function, basically. At least I hope that it could be relatively simple to fix. It might not be, depending on their development process and the technology they use and how they arrived at the color and stuff like that, and how interconnected all their systems are. But it might not be an easy fix, but it's a relatively simple fix, right? We know what's wrong and we know how to fix it. It's not like something more abstract where it's a gameplay problem where it's like, this just doesn't feel right to me. That's going to be a harder problem to even begin solving, even if it's a more interesting problem. What else am I thinking about here? I wanted to give like a pretty robust criticism of the game. Yeah, I feel like so one of the things I don't like about the game is the growth rate of cities. City growth just feels, and I think they've been trying to get this right from the beginning, and I understand the problem they have. So let me describe. Hold on, I have a lot to say here about this city growth thing. So here's my problem. If you have a surplus of 50 food, you'll roughly grow between 40 and 50% of a population every single turn. If you have a surplus of 500 food, you'll grow 90% of a population per turn. Now, I don't know about you, but that makes me feel like food scaling is off. It's just, I don't think they've ever got this right in any of the open devs. I think it's an issue that is being a bit of a thorn in their paw. They can't get it to feel right because of the way the other systems are interacting with it. Because you're capable of getting like surplus 500 food, they have to put these sort of soft brakes on how fast you can grow. But that feels terrible as a player. If I focus heavily on growth, if I focus heavily on growing a huge city, I feel like I'm being punished. Because if I make 500 surplus food, I end up with only like double the output of a 50 surplus food in terms of how much population I'm getting, right? You go from 50% growth to 90% growth. If I go from 50 production to 500 production, it feels amazing. I have so much money. I can do whatever I want. I can build and buy and do everything I want in that city. The same can't be said of food. And then population are too hard to come by because of this, the way all these systems interact, because you can get so much food from all these districts and the scaling buildings and all that sort of stuff. And that makes it so that the farmer job is actually terrible in anything that is like a remotely high food build, because he produces 6 food, but that 6 food gets less and less value the more food you have, and it's almost like quadratically. It's like it's approaching a limit of how useful it can be. Like the first 6 food, you get almost 100% of the value. But by the time you get to 60 food, you're maybe getting 10% of the value for another 6 food. And then by the time you get to 600 food, you're maybe getting like 0.1% of the value if you add another 6 food. And the farmers generate 6 food as a baseline, just to kind of put that in perspective where that number comes from. And I think the only time that working a farmer job is worth it is when you haven't built any farming districts. Like, that's just, like, unironically. And it makes me feel like farming-based builds are weak and terrible, because not only is it really hard to grow population doesn't do enough. They don't produce enough. They produce 6 production baseline, 6 gold baseline, or 6 science baseline, or 6 food baseline, and that just feels I don't know. That doesn't feel like, in some ways, right at the start of the game, it feels like too much. Like, because you start off with 3 science, and you put your first citizen in the scientist slot, and now you're making 9 science. You just tripled your science. That feels like too much. But also, as the game gets later and later, even though you have a massively bigger population, each individual pop is still only producing as if they were like, you might go up to like 8 or 9 of a resource per population. So you might make 9 food per population instead of 6. And I feel like that scaling also needs to be addressed. I feel like population should produce a little bit less resources early in the game, and they should instead produce more in the late game. So maybe you start off, a scientist at 3 science, you build your basic school, they go up to 4, you build a researcher, they go up to 5, maybe you make a decision, like a political decision, in the civic screen, which is a screen I really like. I really like the civic screen. It's really, really cool. There are problems with it that I will talk about as we continue. But yeah, I feel like the resources that population generate, and again, I think it's good that if you're sitting here and listening to this, is that most of the things I'm talking about are like balance. You know what I mean? Like, these are the complaints I have about the game. It's like balance and then sort of obscure visual problems I have with the game. Conceptually, I don't think there's anything wrong with the game. With the exception of one system that I will talk about. I'm going to be talking about the fame system later. Which I think is one of the bugbears with the game that I have. But I also wanted to take a moment to talk about the influence system. In this latest build, they were kind of playing around with some stuff, and I think it misses the mark. It just doesn't feel right or good to me, the way that it works. The influence is made a much bigger and important resource early game, but it's also just like super irrelevant late game. I think I understand why they want to have influence in their game, because they've had it in since like Endless Legend, or Endless Space rather. It's a resource in basically all of their games, and I think it's not an easy thing to fix. Influence is, because right now the balance for influence is, I'll use the description of it. It's like a very steep hill. If you're trying to climb that hill, it sucks. Okay, like, trying to get enough influence to the top of that hill is awful, and it's really terrible. Early game, it just feels horrendous. You never feel like you have enough of it. Everything feels too expensive. Your influence, it feels like it's hard to get influence, all that sort of stuff. But then when you get to the top of that hill and you unlock a few things, and it's like bam, 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 all right, great, I got to the top of the hill, I can do everything I want, I can get all the things I need, I've overcome the influence hump. And it's sort of like, when you get to the top of that hill, you see like a ski lift on the other side, and it's like, well, it's not going to be like you're not allowed to ski down, right? You're not allowed to enjoy the slope down because now influence doesn't matter because you have so much, you've taken care of all your problems, and now influence is irrelevant, and that's a problem. And I think the way to fix it is to stop trying to treat influence like a currency. I think influence should be more like a capacity. So what I mean like that is, instead of influence, it's sort of more like stability, right? So instead of influence being like a resource that you accumulate from, your population and your districts and your all these sorts of things, influence should maybe be a little bit more like a number, like a cap. So maybe you start the game, you have 10 influence, and that lets you, build an outpost. And that uses up 5 of your 10 influence. And then you build another outpost, and that uses up another 5 of your 10 outposts. So you can kind of manage 2 outposts early game. And, you increase your influence by maybe having more population, because that gives you more power, right? So influence is more like a power thing. So if you build if you get more population, your influence capacity goes up. So once you have 5 population, now you have 15 influence, and you can plop down another outpost, right? There's all these. I think the game would work better with that, because I feel like all the other game systems would play nicer with it, because then things like, for example, the laws you can pass, instead of being like a one-time, you paid for this law, you paid 60 influence, boom, you have this ability unlocked forever. You unlock it, and you're paying influence for that every turn because it's taking away from your capacity. And if you go over your capacity, that could lower your stability. If you change your laws, that could cause negative events, because like a sudden political shift from, like, I don't know, autocracy to republicanism, you could instead use the narrative elements of the game to deal with those balance problems. So for example, if you are really, really strongly authoritarian in your game, and you try to make the switch from the autocracy policy to the republic policy, depending on how far into the authoritarian ideology you are, maybe you get an event a turn later or the same turn that causes like a noble rebellion. The nobles rebel and they say no, and it gives you sort of multiple options. It's like, okay, maybe the first option is like the nobles will need to be appeased, and it makes that law cost twice as much influence to maintain. You know what I mean? And then maybe the third option is like, let them eat cake or something, and then you'll get a bunch of noble units to appear in your empire. I think that sort of approach would be a little bit better than basically what amounts to accumulating a currency that doesn't do much for you. It's just influence is in like a weird place where it's too important and not important enough. So I think I'd like to see it maybe moved more towards like a capacity model, where influence is a continuously generated resource. Excess influence is essentially discarded. And if you're over your influence, if you are spending too much influence compared to how much you're generating, you take a penalty. Paradox games do this really well with something like force limit, right? So in EU4, maybe you're only allowed to have 10 units before you start to take penalties. So you have 10 units and you don't take any penalties. But then maybe you're like, man, I'm about to have a war, and I really don't like that he has the same size army as me. I'm gonna kind of overrun my I'm gonna overwrite my force limit and build above it. So maybe you throw down 2 more cavalry. So now you're 20% above your force limit, and now you're paying the game penalizes you by making your units, I don't know, I can't remember how the math exactly works, but it's something like, because you're 20% over your force limit, all of your units are 20% more expensive, which becomes a really big problem, because like, if you have 10 units costing, 1 gold per turn in total or one ducat per month to maintain, if you go up to 12 now the base cost is 1.2 gold, right, of all those units, but you're also taking a 20% penalty, so that actually shoots up to almost 1.35-ish gold, which means you're paying a lot more. Like, you're paying almost 35% more gold to maintain this only slightly larger army. And I think you could do something like that with the influence system. I think that would just work a little bit better, and it would also be more thematic with what influence seems to want to be. And I think it would play nice with a lot of the ways that influence works, because you could make it would make the all mechs pretty interesting. Because let's say it costs one influence to maintain. It costs one influence to maintain a an outpost, right? And then you have the Olmecs who get +1 influence per territory. Oh, that's interesting. So now it's free for them to maintain their outposts, which would be a really interesting idea. And then maybe you could figure out a different way to slow down, outposts and outpost buildings and stuff like that. Because influence is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for. Influence is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for certain parts of the game in the early game, in that it's acting very much so like a sort of a handbrake for the player to keep them from just skyrocketing off too quickly. And the problem is that once you overcome that handbrake, the handbrake is no longer needed, and then you're kind of left with like a vestigial resource. So I think they either need to like rework influence, or they need to just find more uses for it and get the numbers right. And I feel like, in my opinion, the getting the numbers right part of that is going to be very, very hard with the way the game systems interact and work, which is why I think it just make it a capacity. Make it a capacity. It'll make your game simpler. It'll thematically work pretty well. And you can figure out a new way for players to get influence. Maybe you get some influence from your population. Maybe you get some influence from how big your cities are. Maybe districts cost influence. There's lots of things you could do. Maybe here's an interesting idea. All right. Maybe every individual army you have wandering around the map is going to cost you some influence capacity, right? That would make abilities like Rome's army size a little bit more impactful, because now it's actually quite expensive to have an army roaming around. But Rome can get plus one unit into an army, which means the influence cost for them to have a bigger number of units out on the map is actually cheaper. But yeah, I think that's my thoughts on influence. Now, I also wanted to talk about the fame system in the game. The fame system, I like it. It's kind of like, I really like the system at its fundamental idea level. And I think all of my problems to do with it are actually just execution and game feel. And otherwise, the system is great. Like, it's fantastic. It does exactly what it wants to do. It gives a player a diverse set of goals for an era. And, what the player is doing is always kind of getting a slight reward, right? Because if you're building up the number of districts in your cities, you're getting a fame star. If you're building up your population, you're getting a fame star. If you're building up your influence, you're getting a fame star. And I think one of my problems with the fame system is that some of the they're kind of treated as if they're individual goals, right? However, some of them are dependent upon each other. And the perfect example is the expansionist star and the aesthetic star. So right now, how the game works, we're going to talk about fame again very briefly, is that the expansionist star gives you rewards for attaching territories to your cities, right? If you have 7 cities, or if you have 7 territories connected to your cities, you'll get a star, say, right? And that's the first star, and then there'll be another one at like 11 and another one at 15. The problem is with this is that there's also a star that gives you or also a fame goal that gives you a star when you achieve influence, and influence is the currency you use to attach territories to your cities. And so what that feels like to me is that actually the territory star is secondary, right? It's just for 99% of players outside of those actually playing specifically expansionists who have unique interactions for stealing territory from other players. In reality, the territory star is just a fame or an influence check, which means you're better off just focusing on getting the influence-based star. And a lot of the things feel this way with how they interact. Like the population star and the quarter star, they kind of feel like they interact. I had better examples of this previously, but I've kind of forgotten some of the things I had kind of wrote down. The military star, like, where you kill units, that kind of is technically dependent upon the technology star and things, and it's okay for these things to interact, but I think there's a couple of them that are like too dependent on the other star to where it's actually just a worse version of that other goal. So like, to me, the most obvious criticism I did see, it's been a day or two since I've played the game, so I'm kind of forgetting all the things I thought about. The most obvious criticism is that the territory-based star is straight up just a worse version of the influence-generating star, and that they're completely dependent upon each other. And so, in reality, it doesn't feel like there's 7 things I can do in an era. It feels like there's 6 things, and occasionally, if I spend my influence, I'll get a star. And that's kind of how I feel about it. And then also on the fame system, I feel like you go through fame too quickly. And what I mean by that is you advance to the next era too quickly. Because there's the 7 achievements you can do, right? The 7 different stars you can earn, and each of them you can earn them 3 times. So there's a possible 21 stars you can get. And you need 7 to advance to the next era. That means you only have to do, like, you can pretty much advance every 20 turns. Like, if you know what you're doing and you're building correctly and you're playing the game correctly, you can hit your fame milestones like bam, bam, bam. And you can get straight from like the ancient era to like almost the industrial era in like 120 turns. And I think that needs some adjustment. I think the fame system, it takes too few stars, and the goals are a little bit too easy. I would maybe consider adding another star and bumping it up to 9 stars or something, like adding another thing a player can do. I definitely feel like the fame system needs a few last minute tweaks. Mostly it's good. It works as a mechanic. It's really cool. I really like it. It just has a few like weird edge cases that don't feel good. I feel like I go through the eras too quickly, and I feel like there's a huge incentive for me to leave my era really, really fast. To the point where there was multiple times when I was playing that I would be in the medieval era. Or sorry, I would be in like the early modern era, and I would still only just be starting to research medieval era technologies, which doesn't feel right to me. That feels like it's off, and I think that needs some adjustment. So I think maybe they should try to slow that down. I think a very simple way to do this, actually, unironically, a really, really easy way to fix this, and maybe I'm talking at my ass here, is to make the player need more stars, so maybe 11 stars, and then as the fame score for different achievements starts to come down, also lower their requirements. That acts as like a natural catch-up mechanic. So maybe at the start of the era, if you build 11 districts, you get a star, and then the next one is 15, and the next one is 19. Maybe, after someone advances to the next era, the score of those things goes down faster, but the requirements also go down. So there's kind of a built-in catch-up mechanic. They have a catch-up mechanic in the game, but I don't know if it really works very well. It's like once someone advances to the next era, 24 turns later, you get a free star, which is like, that's really slow. And I think, I don't know. It's a system that needs adjustment. There's a few other small problems I have with the game. I was having some trouble with the military aspect of the game. I think one of the big things that they just need to let players do is to be able to choose where their flag goes. Like, let me just move. Like, if I'm being attacked by someone and my defensive flag is placed somewhere really bad automatically by the battle AI, I just straight up lose a fight that I should have won, and that feels terrible. It makes me frustrated. It makes me not want to play the game. So I think that's something. Don't place the flag automatically like that. Let me have some influence as a player to be able to correct. Because like 99% of the time, I'm not going to move the flag. But in that 1% of time when the game screws me and puts it somewhere terrible, I really wish I had the option to be able to just move at a tile. Just move at a tile or two. Just let me do that and I'd be super happy. Because I've had a couple of times, I even made a tweet about it, is the flag would spawn in really inopportune places, and then I would just auto lose a battle that I should have easily won because I'm doing an attrition-based warfare, and they just rush my flag and kick all my units back to my cities, and it's like, ugh, I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. I hate it when that happens. The battle system itself, I think I talked about how the size of your individual stacks of your armies is kind of irrelevant because there's no real cost to piling in reinforcements into a battle and just getting as many units in there as possible anyway. So I think there should be adjustments there. Maybe it could be as simple as a unit cohesion buff or something. It's like if your army is undersized, it gets a slight debuff or something, or if your army is filling out all of its slots, it gets a buff. I don't know. There's a few different things you could work with there. I'm trying to think of any now last criticisms I had of the game as I was playing it. I think that really just kind of covers all of it. Is that, you know, the influence system is a little bit gnarly. Sorry, not influence. Influence system. The influence system is a little bit gnarly. The fame system needs a few adjustments. The balance of the game is a little bit out of whack. Otherwise, they have like a really good game. Like, it's interesting. There's interesting mechanics. City building is fun. Combat is reasonably fun. I do think I'd like to see some experimentation with unit abilities, like giving pikemen, I don't know, like fortify, or giving, archers harassment attacks or whatever. Just like some experimentation with the unit system would be cool. I think the system works, but it does feel very much so like a terrain and technology check than like a battle tactics check. It's very much so, do I have enough units to auto win? No. Okay, can I? Or it's like, here's how the battle flow works in my head when I'm initiating a battle and I'm looking at it and I'm trying to decide if I'm going to win this battle. First thing I ask is, am I technologically ahead? If I'm technologically ahead, I essentially auto win. And then the second question I ask, okay, are we technologically on par? Yes, we're technologically on par. Great, we can move to the next step. And then the next question is, am I technologically behind? And if yes, I just auto lose. And so only one of those scenarios is interesting, because then I get to move on to the next part of my flow chart. Is like, okay, we're technologically on par. Do I have more units than him? Yes, auto win. Do I have the same number of units as him? Okay, I go to the next step in the thing. I go to the next step in the flow chart. Do I have less units than him by a significant margin? Auto lose, right? And then the next step of the flow chart is, okay, we have the same technology. We have the same number of units roughly. Do I have the terrain advantage? If yes, auto win. Do we have an equal level of terrain? Move on to the next step of the flow chart. Does he have better terrain? Okay, auto lose. And that's how it feels like, the flow chart. I have to go through like so many steps and checks sort of mentally before, like, the game puts so many little checks on what's happening in a battle, just like sort of organically and emergently through its systems, like technology, numbers, terrain, bam. And then, like, if all of those things line up to where you guys are equal, boom, now you're actually playing the battle. Now you're actually having an interesting battle, because you're like, okay, if I put this unit on this side and I put this archer on this tile and I attack him, this archer has a special ability that will harass him and make his attack do less damage. And then this pikeman will be positioned on this tile because I know his cavalry are going to try to get around to attack my archers. So if I'm ready to counter that, and then the battles become interesting. Whereas in all those steps up in the flowchart where you auto win or auto lose, the battles are just really uninteresting. So I think, like, this might be a bit of a controversial thing to say, but like, human technology didn't really advance, like, in warfare that much for thousands of years. Like there's an argument to be made that you could take like a late Renaissance army, pre-gunpowder, or sort of like, when I say late Renaissance, I mean like maybe late medieval, like sort of gunpowder isn't really a thing yet, and pitch it up against, like Athens, Alexander's hoplites. And you would maybe imagine that Alexander's hoplites, right, against this like late French army with heavy cavalry, heavy armor, all that sort of stuff. You could imagine that Alexander's hoplites might not get immediately crushed. Like if they have the right terrain, if they're in a defensive spot, they have choke points, they have their phalanxes, maybe they can take them. Maybe like it'll be a costly battle, but maybe they can take them. Whereas I think right now in Humankind, and the point there is, but that's not true of a like late Renaissance army, but that's not true of like a World War I army versus a World War II army. The World War II army wins every time, and the same thing is like an army from 2020 destroys an army from the year 2000. But I don't think that's true from an army from like 3000 BC against an army from like 1000 BC. I think those things are like pretty like depending like. It's not just a straight up technology win. It depends. Like maybe one side has iron, sure, has better iron, and maybe they have higher quality stuff. But maybe, you know, the 3000 BC army has a hill. Maybe they have really good defensive terrain. Maybe they have really good earthworks. Maybe they have fortresses. Maybe they can hold down. Like all that sort of stuff. That's my point. Is what I'm trying to make. I feel like the combat numbers, they grow too quickly. I feel like what you want is like a very mild numeric progression. So like an ancient era warrior is like. I think how it works in the game right now is an ancient era warrior is 17 combat strength, and then the swordsman is like 25. I think that should be more like 17 and 20. That's my take. It shouldn't, like the jump is too big. The jump is too big, and then what you want is when you get to like gunpowder, like late game industrial era gunpowder, and you get your first rifle units, that's when the jump should be like, okay, these old melee units that carry in halberds, those are like 40 combat strength. These guys at rifles, boom, they're 70 combat strength. It's like if you get the gunpowder first, you get a massive advantage. And right now it feels like there's just kind of like this smooth little stepping stone, like you're constantly going up at the same rate. You know, you get plus 7 combat strength at this upgrade, you get plus 7 combat strength at this upgrade, you get plus 7 combat strength at this, and I don't like it. It feels wrong to me. I don't know. These are just thoughts I'm having. I'm thinking about the game. I've been sitting here talking about the game for an hour. Like it's obvious that I really, really enjoy the game, even despite the fact that I'm essentially sitting here criticizing it. And look, here's the thing. Everything I say here, I also want to put a caveat here. The developers don't have to do every single thing I say here. What I'm doing right now is providing how I feel about the game. And that's the more important thing, is because they can take, okay, what is the feeling? He feels like units' combat strength progresses too quickly. That's the takeaway there. And my solution was, you know, very simple, is to change the scaling. But the developer's solution might be different, and I think that's okay. I want to be very clear. I'm not telling them how to design and change their game. What I am doing is I'm trying to communicate the things that felt wrong to me about the game. And that will be used as a sort of place to think about, okay, what can we change then that sort of fits within the scope of what he's feeling? All right, let me think. Do I have any other criticisms of the game as it stands? And again, I want to make sure this isn't a review. This is just some feedback on the closed beta. A lot of people in my last video said I was like shilling and sponsored by Humankind. That video was not sponsored. I'm not shilling for Humankind. I was just really, really enjoying the game that day, and I recorded a very positive video. And similarly, I'm still really enjoying the game, but I felt like I owed it to my fans to bring up as many of my honest criticisms of the game as well, because I don't want to be somebody who maybe drives hype to a game that disappoints people, because that would lower people's trust in me as a sort of authoritative person who speaks about games. I don't know if that's like the right way to phrase that, but basically I want to make sure that I maintain the trust of my audience. So that's why I'm sitting down here and I'm gonna criticize the game and maybe defuse a little bit of the hype, but not like torpedo it, but just like let's make sure that we're being realistic in our expectations of the game. Like I'm still pre-ordering the game because I plan to play it. I love the game. I really enjoy it. That might not be true for you. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. Make sure you know you want the game. Make sure it fits in your budget. Do all of those things. If the game fits in your budget, if you're excited to play it, and if you're okay with being a part of the journey that strategy games go through now. Because remember, when this game releases, it's not going to be the final game we play. What we're going to do is we're going to play this game, we're going to experience it, we're going to enjoy it, and then, you know, some months later, or maybe even weeks, who knows, an update is going to come out, and it's going to change the game in some ways. And for me, part of the excitement of playing games like Civilization, playing games like Dota 2, or even Paradox Interactive games, is that I'm actually in on the journey. I'm in on the journey. I get to play each patch and see how the game develops. And then I get to give my feedback. I'm like, well, I didn't really like that feature. I didn't like that thing. And I may only put like 20, 30 hours into each patch for some of these games. But I get to experience the evolution of the game. And that to me is like really, really interesting. Now, I get that some people find that tedious. I get that some people find that boring, or that they find that confusing and difficult because the game is always changing. I like that. That's something I like, and I feel like that's what's probably, I would say that's probably what's going to happen with Humankind. The game is going to probably, like almost certainly, be continuously developed after launch. I would expect to see DLC. I would expect to see patches. I would expect to see occasional reworks, occasional new mechanics. I'm really excited what the future holds for Humankind, and I'm excited to get to be a part of that journey. Like, and that's a choice that I make as a consumer of games, and that's a choice that you're going to have to make as a consumer of games as well. Do you have the time to even play this game and participate in that? If no, don't worry about it. Maybe wait till a couple of patches come out and then buy it. Maybe wait till a sale. But if you're like me and you enjoy that and you want to be a part of it and you have the money, jump in heads first, dude. It's gonna be a fun game. I think the community is gonna get a huge amount of fun out of this. That's it for me. I love you all very much, and I hope my criticism video lived up to what you wanted. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.